Well, the three-step zigzag or multiple zigzag is really the best stitch choice to keep those edges not only finished from fraying, but also laying flat. So the first thing we'll do is select our three-step zigzag stitch. It looks kind of like a zigzag, but it's got 3 little straight stitches in each zig and 3 little straight stitches in each zag. And then we'll select a stitch length appropriate for finishing the edges of seams. And that would be somewhere around 1 or just a little bit less, quite a short stitch length. Now here's a piece of fabric that really could use some help because it's got quite a bit of fraying here. So to prevent that fraying, we'll place it under the presser foot so that the needle is going to swing to the right and get near or off the edge. And now as I stitch, you'll see that where a zigzag would tend to pull that edge up and actually roll it or pucker it, this three-step zigzag is going to keep it laying flatter. Plus, what I love about it is that it's going to give 3 little stitches catching all those fibers, so you're not going to get nearly the fraying. If you have a few threads hanging off, which I did before I started, just trim those away, those little extra frayed stitches, and now you'll see that this is firmly stitched and won't be fraying anymore. And then you can go forth and sew your seams with finished seams with your straight stitch and press them open. And you'll have nice finished seams on your finished garment. Another thing I really like the three-step zigzag for is mending. And I have a patch on these jeans. This patch is actually from a contrasting fabric, but it could just as well have been a chunk of a pair of old jeans. When you have a big hole in jeans, that darning isn't going to work. So cut a patch, lay it on, and three-step zigzag all the way around the edge to hold it in place. And you'll see that that will be a very firm mend on jeans and other garments that have large holes. Well, better than finishing a seam and pressing it open, which is what we were just doing, what about being able to sew the seam and finish it all in one step? You have a special stitch on your new white just for that. And so we'll turn the stitch down 1 stitch to select the seam overcast stitch. And this is actually a seam overcast stitch for knits and for wovens, and it will sew the seam and finish it all in one step. So I have kind of a sweatshirt fabric here. I love this for sweatshirts, and I'm going to place it underneath the foot, ready to sew. But because this is a stretch stitch, there's one thing we need to remember that's very important. The stitch length has to be at the longest setting. Now guess what? There's a little code to remind you of that. Because here you see the little dot with the circle. That means turn the stitch length dial to the dot with the circle. A stretch stitch or forward and back stitch, which you're just lucky enough to have here, means that you're going to use that stretch stitch setting. And so now as we begin to sew, you will see that our stitch sews and overcasts the edge all in one. You can sew at the 1/4-inch edge, or you can sew in from the edge and trim it later. It's really your choice. But what this is going to do, even on this thick fabric, it's going to sew this, and we could come back and trim off any excess seam allowance. It's going to give us a very stretchy seam. This will not break on this fabric in any way, and yet a very sturdy seam for any type of particularly active wear garments that you're making or other sewing. The other place I just love this stitch is for ribbing. And again, this video is to teach you how to use the stitches and what they're used for and all the stitch functions. If you haven't done any sewing of stretch garments or t-shirts or swimwear, sign up for a class because those things are easy to sew, and you'll find that your new white will handle those fabrics beautifully. So here you see we would sew our ribbing, and when you take that class, you're going to find out that you stretch the ribbing around the neckline, and you'll see that we will have finished ribbing virtually just like store-bought. Okay, we'll take a look at that ribbing now, and you'll see not only is it a very, very strong seam that's not going to break when you pull that ribbing over your head or over your foot or arm, but you'll see that it's a very nice finished seam on the inside of your ribbed garment as well. And that's all done with that great stretch seam overcast stitch on your new white. You have another special stretch stitch, and that's actually the straight stretch stitch, or I like to call it also the reinforced straight stitch. Of course, it's intended for stretch fabric so that when you pull it, it wouldn't break. So I've dialed that straight stretch stitch on the stitch dial, and of course it has that little mark to show us that it is a stretch stitch, and so the length needs to be set all the way to 4. If you set the length somewhere in here with any of these stretch stitches, you won't have any feed. They'll be just sitting in one place. So be sure that you set that length to 4. But now you could mend crotch seams on pants and trousers. You could stitch seams on knitwear. Because the stitch stitches forward one and then back one, it's a very, very strong stitch, and it's going to hold through anything. This is one, if you don't know it's going to fit, I would baste it first, because this would be a real hard one to pull out. But it's a very sturdy stitch that you're not going to tear or break on your garment. So use it for mending and also for construction. Now, we talked a little bit earlier about top stitching. We can do top stitching and decorative stitching with something special that's called a twin needle. Now, twin needles actually replace the standard needle. They are 2 needles on one what's called shank. And they come in different sizes, meaning different widths between the needle, and also in different sizes for weights of fabric, like any sewing machine needle. They come for stretch fabrics, that's what the blue means, and they come for regular fabrics, that's what the red means. And so we're going to remove our standard needle, and this is real easy to do. If it's in there real tight the first time, use your screwdriver, and there's a little notch in the needle clamp screw, which is over here to the side. I've had the needle out already, so I know I can turn that with my hand. I loosen that screw and simply pull the needle down and get rid of it. And actually, I would throw my needle away if I've been using it, because I would want to replace it with a new needle. New needle for every project. And anytime you're having any kind of a glitch, I always say change your needle and rethread. Generally, that'll solve it. All right, we insert the twin needle the same way we insert a standard needle. And that is to take that needle and to push it up as far as it will go in. But we want to notice that there's a flat side on that shank. The flat side goes to the back. So insert the needle, push it up as far as it will go, and then tighten the screw to hold it in place. We have only one bobbin with twin needle sewing, so we don't need to do anything down in the bobbin area, but we do want to put a second thread on the top. So we have one to thread through each of the needles. So in this case, I'm going to pull up my second spool pin, which is right there, and I'm going to put my second thread in place, and I normally have one thread reeling off the back of the spool and one thread reeling off the front of the spool. This thread is threaded just as we threaded in the beginning of the tape, with one exception. Here at the tension discs, one goes on one side of the tension disc and the other goes on the other side. All right? Again, we go into the take-up. If you've forgotten how to thread, go back to the first part of the tape and just review that with yourself. And I have found it's easier to thread this guide that's at the bottom of the faceplate by opening that door just a little bit. There we go. Now we thread the 2 needles. One thread goes into one needle, the other thread goes into the other needle. What the twin needle gives you that's so great is the opportunity to sew every single one of your stitches and many of your stitch functions in another way. Actually, 2 rows of it, perfectly stitched side by side. Okay, now for twin needle sewing, the first thing we would want to do would be to actually select a straight stitch for that straight row of stitching we're going to sew. And I'm going to use just a standard fabric, but because we're actually doing a stitching on a single thickness, I have stabilizer underneath that. So we'll take and put that underneath the presser foot, lower the presser foot, straight stitch, and we'll start to sew. Now we've got a very long stitch length, but let's take a look at what that looks like. We may want to shorten up the stitch length for this top stitching. Remember, you have that option always. And I would always start by experimenting on scraps before you sew anything. But look at that, 2 rows of stitching, perfectly side by side. I mean, you can't beat that, can you? When you do it without stabilizer underneath, you will get what we call pin tucks. And this is another of the stitch functions on your machine. A straight stitch with no stabilizer, and generally this would be at about a 2.5 stitch length. And you would sew row after row, and what would happen, because there's no stabilizer underneath, you'll get a little bit of a tucking up of that fabric to create that little pin tuck, we call it. Remember, this would be a great hem on a knit fabric because there's only one bobbin. And for that reason, you have a zigzag stitch going back and forth back there, so you have a little bit of elasticity to the stitch for hemming on a knit. Now, can you use other stitches with thread needle? You sure can. No problem. We're going to try some of our other stitches. Let's set our zigzag, because that would be the main one that we would use. But let's point out that our zigzags are different widths. Remember how that needle would swing from side to side? And as we would swing from side to side, we want to be sure that we're not too wide to be sewing twin needle with our decorative zigzag. So be sure of that as you're sewing. You go to the 3 or 4 width, let me show you what will happen. As you swing, you're liable to get too close to that foot. So stick with those narrower widths, turn it with the hand wheel first, and the different widths of needles will mean it will look different too. Now that you've learned about all these great stitch functions for sewing, we have one more kind of sewing that's very creative, and that's free motion sewing. Free motion meaning you move the fabric. Let's see how to do that. First thing we're going to do, I've actually rethreaded with a standard needle, a regular sewing needle, and I've threaded the top and the needle with the silky pretty thread. In the bobbin, I have a fine weight white thread because you're not going to see that in embroidery unless somebody's looking at the backside. And we will now take off the presser foot. In other words, not only the foot, but the actual ankle. Take everything off so that you have just the needle exposed. I often remove the screw too if I'm going to do a big project, just so it isn't there in my way as I'm moving the fabric. And then one more very important thing, since we're going to be moving the fabric, we're going to drop those feed teeth again. They will be out of the way, and we're ready to begin. Let's start with a straight stitch. That's called seed stitch embroidery. The stitch length really doesn't matter because the feed teeth are down. But if you put it on 0, they won't be moving so much, so they'll be out of the way and not moving under there. We are going to put our fabric in a hoop. And this actually is a spring hoop designed for machine sewing. You could certainly use any embroidery hoop you have at home, as long as it'll slide under the ankle, and there is a lot of room there. Be sure to use stabilizer underneath your work, and sometimes you'll put this actually in the hoop. You can try it both ways. And this is one time that I would suggest that you bring up that bobbin thread before you begin sewing. Okay, that would be important. For free motion sewing, there's one more thing I'd recommend, and that is that you use that great extension or flatbed sewing surface. In other words, bring that in and slide it in place, because you're going to want to have the larger surface for you to be sewing on as you help to move your fabric yourself. All right, we're ready to begin sewing, but we've got to remember the most important thing in free motion sewing. We talked about this before, and that is if you don't lower the presser foot, you won't have any tension on the thread. And if that happens, you're going to have threads all gobbled underneath because there's no tension. I will tell you that's the hardest thing to remember in free motion is to lower the presser foot, because there's no foot going down, just the bar. But it's not the bar that it's important. It's those discs up here that are closing down on the thread and giving tension. So I usually write a little note up here, lower presser foot, when I'm doing free motion sewing. So I'm sure to remember that. Lower that presser foot, engage the tension, And now you can simply sew. But if you don't move the fabric, nothing is going to happen. It won't go anywhere. You see, it'll just sit in one place. Now, when you have a straight stitch like I have now, you have like a line that you can use to actually write with, to draw with. You can do cursive lettering. You can do fun things. Now, if you see that lighter color bottom thread coming up, often with decorative sewing like this, we might lower the top tension just slightly, maybe to a 3 or so. And again, you'd want to experiment with this before you'd be doing your garment. So that's straight stitch embroidery and monogramming. But now you have all these wonderful different zigzags to use. So simply set whatever size zigzag you want, and now you will have a zigzag. And here again, I'm moving that fabric as I'm sewing. And you'll see that we are seeing some of that white thread. And so if we're doing that with our zigzag stitch, we would actually lower that top thread tension just a little bit more. Less tension on the top, more tension on the bottom means that we have more pull on the bobbin. You can actually fill in places. In this case, you could do it like so, or you can, as we did before, use a wider width of zigzag and write a letter to monogram. Free motion embroidery is something that takes some practice. There's no question. You don't want to turn your hoop. You just want to move it. You want to run this machine at a comfortable speed for you. I like to do my own initials because I've done a lot of them. I've practiced it, but you will want to practice with free motion embroidery and take a class if this is something that you're particularly interested in. Now, a very forgiving free motion embroidery, I'm going to take this one out, and we'll talk a little bit about stippling. This is one of those white website projects. Stippling is very popular in quilting, where you just use that straight stitch and you're kind of using the needle as a pencil to draw lots of little squiggly lines. But there's a difference with most stippling, and that is that there's batting involved. So what we're going to do is have batting underneath, and we will actually hoop our fabric and our batting. By the way, I didn't talk about this with the applique. This stabilizer just tears away after you've created your project, and then you press it. So don't be afraid to just rip that off. Now we've got batting and we've got fabric, and for stippling, it's just kind of like puzzle drawing. So we'll go back to that straight stitch setting. Again, we're going to bring up that bobbin thread before we start. And we do that by bringing the bobbin thread up the same way we brought it up after we threaded. But keep it on the top because it's a little easier to work with. You're not going to know where it is. Now, we simply, to stipple, use that straight stitch and go back and forth. And once you get started, it's a good practice to take and cut those threads and get them out of the way. This is sort of like drawing little puzzle shapes. And in true stippling, and I did remember to put that down, I didn't remember to put that down. Be sure to put that presser foot down or your stitch quality will be terrible. So you want to be sure and put that presser foot down and sew that stippling. And the rule in stippling is that you shouldn't ever cross over the lines. But my rule is just to have fun with it. Just do whatever you feel like looks good. If you want to do curly cues, go ahead and do curly cues. Again, practice a little bit with some of these techniques. Practice with your sewing machine. Sewing is not something that you learn overnight, but it is such a wonderful, fun hobby to be enjoying. We hope that you've gotten a lot of ideas of ways to use your new white sewing machine. And we hope, too, that you will take some classes, visit all the sewing stores in your area, make new friends, make new sewing friends, read books, read some of the sewing publications, and be sure to visit the white website. The other thing we want to be sure you know is that you should take good care of your sewing machine and have it tuned up regularly at your local sewing machine store. Keep it dusted, change the needle, brush the lint out of the bobbin area. That's really all the care that's required for your white. Well, until next time, I wish to all of you happy sewing.